Hi everyone, welcome to Reformed Catholic. This is Jeff, and this channel is all about apologetics, ecumenism, philosophy, and theology from a Reformed Catholic perspective. And this particular video will focus on Sola Scriptura, which is Latin for Scripture alone. And in this video, we'll be exploring 7 arguments against Sola Scriptura, especially from Roman Catholics, and show how they don't really succeed. But before we get to that point, we've got to ask ourselves, what exactly is it? What is Sola Scriptura? What is Scripture alone? I actually think that it's a combination of 3 ideas. First is the idea that Scripture is the ultimate authority, not the only authority. Reason, tradition, councils, creeds, ecclesiastical tradition, all of that has a part to play, but the final, ultimate, infallible authority is Scripture alone. Second, it's the idea that Scripture is sufficient. This is the argument that Scripture is the only infallible source for faith and practice. Again, there might be other sources out there, your pastor, your priest, tradition, all those things might be very important and even extremely important. But at the end of the day, Scripture is the only ultimate, divinely ordained, infallible source. The final one is clarity, and this is one that's probably the most misunderstood. This is the idea that the Bible is clear to every Christian, for anyone who reads it, regarding matters of salvation. Again, it doesn't mean that the teaching of every single doctrine is clear, or that what you want out of Scripture will be there. That's not the point. The point is that the question of how can you be reconciled with God, how can you be saved, that answer is very clear. You can read it and access it directly, and you don't need another third-party medium to do that for you. So it's these 3 ideas: authority, sufficiency, and clarity. Now, this is very different to what Roman Catholics believe. For Roman Catholics, there are 2 sources of divine, infallible, ultimate authority. It's the Church and sacred tradition. In addition to the Church and sacred tradition, you also have the magisterium. The magisterium just refers to the Church's teaching authority of the Pope and the bishops when they make certain decisions regarding doctrine and faith. When the magisterium teaches in certain contexts, their kind of pronouncements, what they say, is deemed to be infallible. And they are infallibly interpreting Scripture and sacred tradition to give the Roman Catholic Church what it needs. So at the end of the day, it's really a disagreement of both source and norm. How many sources are there? Well, for Protestants, it's the one. It's just Scripture. Whereas for Roman Catholics, it's both Scripture and sacred tradition. And it's a question of norm. Who ultimately defines the final interpretive truth regarding a certain doctrine? Well, for Roman Catholics, it's the magisterium. Whereas for Protestants, we don't really have one. Now, it's really important to distinguish here between the ordinary magisterium and the extraordinary magisterium, because often this gets confused. The ordinary magisterium is not infallible. It's just the ordinary teaching office of the church. Popes and bishops say stuff all the time. And it doesn't mean that every single thing that they say is, divine truth. Whereas the extraordinary magisterium is when the Pope infallibly declares something. It might be a papal council, or it could be something that is said ex cathedra or in a special way. So there are actually very, very few contexts where the magisterium is meant to be infallible. Now, the question is, why should we care? Is there really a big difference between what Protestants believe regarding this topic and what Catholics believe? I think if Sola Scriptura isn't true, none of us should be Protestant. We should all become Roman Catholics or Orthodox if we still want to be followers of Christ. It has profound implications for ecumenism, the nature of God's revelation, Christian history, and so much more, because ultimately it's the question of source and authority. Before we jump into the first argument, let's have a listen from Jimmy Akin from Catholic Answers.
And they say this question is definitively settled. Definitive, it comes from Latin roots, it means brought to an end. And so for once and all time, this question is settled definitively. There is no other option for a Christian believer than to accept proposition P, whatever proposition P is, since this is a philosophy-oriented channel. If they were capable, despite the divine guidance they're given in their mission, if they were capable of being mistaken at that point, they would have just bound the faithful to believe something that was false.
Right.
And and this would have problems because the faithful would have no way of discerning. I mean, we're dealing frequently with very subtle matters that lay people are frankly usually not capable of adjudicating for themselves. And we've got a divinely instituted authority telling us with maximum firmness, you must believe this, Jesus is God. Homoousios, not homoiousios, just one vowel different. And so if they could be mistaken in that circumstance, then they would have bound the faithful to believe error. And we, from an objective point of view, if we either wouldn't know that what they had said was error, in which case we would be believing something false under the maximum firmness of this divinely instituted teaching authority, or if we did realize they were wrong, we would say, we can't trust anything they say, ultimately, because they just screwed up at the highest level of their authority.
Right.
And
So the first argument we will look at is what I called the clarity argument. So this is the argument that the Catholics have a mechanism by which they can come to an infallible understanding of what Scripture is teaching. The idea is that while Protestant scholars can bicker and theologians can disagree amongst themselves, and pastors can divide churches over certain doctrines, there is an epistemological problem that is solved by the magisterium. Roman Catholics will claim that they know what is true because the magisterium is infallibly interpreting divine sources. But I think this is a problem for the magisterium as well. Yes, the magisterium can interpret Scripture, but then who interprets the magisterium? It's you and me. It falls back on the individual to use their private judgment to determine what is true and what isn't true. For the Protestant, they have to interpret Scripture, and for the Roman Catholic, they've got to interpret what the magisterium is saying. At this point, the Catholic apologist might use what is called the essentials argument. This is the argument that actually Roman Catholics do have a clear list of essential doctrines. They're not hard to understand, and these list of items you have to believe can't be mistaken. They can't be argued over. They're so blatantly clear. Protestants don't have such a list. They don't have a list of mandatory doctrines. But the problem is that this list of essential arguments, or rather essential doctrines, keeps changing. The Marian doctrines, especially the Assumption of Mary, was not made dogma until 1950. Sure, Catholics might say, that tradition has been preserved for a long time before that, but that's not the argument here. The argument is about essential doctrines and whether the church can have such a list or not. If that list keeps changing over time, then I would argue that it's not a very comforting or a good way to give Catholics the kind of confidence that they want from the magisterium or from the church's authority. In addition, the first known infallible pronouncement by the Pope was made in 1854 regarding the Immaculate Conception, and the first papal council is considered to be the First Council of Nicaea in 325. Now, what happened to Christians before 325? It would seem almost that Roman Catholics before 325 are no different, no better off, no worse off than Protestants today. So really, the essentials argument doesn't quite work because of this changing list over time. The third argument that might be used is called the unity argument. This is the argument that the magisterium has a special advantage in being able to unite the church. The Protestant Roman Catholic apologists might say there's 30,000 Protestant churches out there, but there's one Catholic church because the magisterium gives us an infallible interpretation that every Catholic is bound to follow. They are, in fact, required to follow. But is this really an advantage? There's got to be a trade-off here, right? Yes, you can unite the whole church by truth, but you can also unite the whole church in error. A political analogy is the difference between an empire and a collection of democratic nation states. Sure, an empire is united by structure, but what happens when the king is evil? What happens if the structure is broken? That kind of unity has a cost. While a collection of nation states who are somewhat friendly toward each other is not united in the traditional sense of the word, there is not a single point of failure. If one nation state falls, the whole church is not broken by that. And that is exactly what's happened in Protestantism over time. What I actually have a problem with is not the Roman Catholic Church's ordinary function. I think it's actually really good. I think it's great that the teach has an official teaching office. I wish we Protestants had it. Now, I've learned a lot from papal encyclicals and from Ratzinger's work, but at the end of the day, the problem is with the extraordinary function. It is when Roman Catholics make the claim that the teachings of the magisterium should be held on the same level as Scripture. The fourth is the logic argument. Apologists in the Roman Catholic camp will often argue that Protestants are caught up by circular reasoning. And you'll hear that from Protestants. Protestants might argue, well, the Bible teaches that the Bible is infallible. And a Roman Catholic will say, well, isn't that circular because the Bible is being used to prove itself? So we actually need the magisterium to tell us infallibly that the Bible is authoritative, that it is infallible. But I think there is a problem with this argument, and it's almost too easy. So if there's any Roman Catholics out there, please comment and let me know what I'm missing here. If the magisterium claims to infallibly make certain doctrinal positions for the church, such as the Bible being infallible and other essential doctrines, then who proves the magisterium? Where does the magisterium get its authority from? At this point, the Roman Catholic might point to certain passages in Scripture which might be used to argue Petrine primacy, like how Peter is the rock. I won't go to that argument. But the point is that Roman Catholics will try to prove the magisterium from the Bible, and then the Bible is then confirmed by the magisterium to be the infallible source from God. So it's a circular argument anyway. So yes, Protestants can be accused of circular reasoning, but Roman Catholics are also bound by circular reasoning with one extra step. It's still circular. The fifth argument is the canon argument. I think this is a very popular one, not so much by more accomplished, popular Roman Catholic apologists and debaters, but I often see certain YouTube comments where this is effectively the case. This is the argument that the church has given us the canon. The church has decided which books should be in the Bible and which books should be out of the Bible. But I think there is a misunderstanding of categories here. When Protestants say that the Bible is divine revelation, what we mean by that is that it is in a category of its own. All other parts of the church, whether it's the people, the structure, the clergy, all other writings, tradition, they're all in a different category of interpreter. We cannot confuse revelation with interpretation. Now, I love Luther's analogy where he talks about Scripture as being kind of like the judge or the law, and church tradition and church authorities as being kind of witnesses or lawyers. Appeals can be made to the judge. You can make a case to the judge, but at the end of the day, the judge has the final say. Michael Kruger has written some excellent stuff on this, because the church doesn't decide on what is revelation. It simply recognizes revelation. And there's a big difference there. The church didn't decide which books of the Bible will be revealed from God or are revealed from God and which ones aren't. The church actually recognized what was already God's revelation. Just like a lawyer recognizes the judge's authority but the lawyer isn't used to ever found or determine the judge's authority. The sixth argument is the doctrine argument. This is the argument that if Sola Scriptura is true, then it needs to have all essential doctrines contained in it. And because Scripture doesn't teach Sola Scriptura, then Sola Scriptura doesn't make sense. Let me put it in a more sort of philosophical way. Right? Premise one, if the Bible is sufficient, then it needs to have all essential doctrines. Premise two, Protestants claim that Sola Scriptura is an essential doctrine. Premise three, the Bible does not teach that Sola Scriptura is an essential doctrine. So conclusion, Sola Scriptura is incoherent. It's a pretty powerful argument when you think about it. Here, Protestants have done a few different things. Some reject premise two. They argue that it is not a doctrine per se, it is a kind of interpretive principle, a prolegomena, or a philosophical assumption for interpreting doctrine. I'm not sure if I'm quite satisfied with the idea that Sola Scriptura is not a doctrine, but only an interpretive principle. And I'll get to why in a second. And some reject premise three and say, actually, Sola Scriptura is taught in the Bible, like 2 Timothy 3:16, at which point the Roman Catholic will say, actually, that's referring to the Old Testament, not the New Testament. But I actually think there is a stronger argument than that. My approach is what I call solus apostoli, or the term apostles alone. I think Sola Scriptura is a derivative doctrine, but a doctrine nonetheless, from the doctrine of the apostles having a special teaching office that no one else had or no one else has today. This is where I think we fundamentally disagree with our Catholic friends. We believe that the apostles had a special office that no one has today, not the Pope, not any other bishop. It was unique. And we see this in Scripture. Paul in Ephesians 2 speaks of the church as having the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. A great deal is made of Judas being replaced with Matthias in Acts. We can keep going on about how the New Testament stresses the importance of the apostles' authority. So we believe in Sola Scriptura precisely because we believe that either the apostles wrote the New Testament or the New Testament was approved by the apostles. And that's the way we actually see the New Testament being received in the early church as well, which is probably another video at some other point. Finally, the seventh argument is the historical argument. Here, Roman Catholic apologists will often use early church figures to support the Catholic position that no one believed in Sola Scriptura. For example, Akin Against Heresy says, what if the apostles had not in fact left writings to us? Would it not be necessary to follow the order of tradition, which was handed down to those to whom they entrusted the churches? But equally, there are other passages that seem to point to Sola Scriptura, even if it's not explicit. For example, Hippolytus says, there is, brethren, one God, the knowledge of whom we gain from the Holy Scriptures and from no other source. Gregory of Nyssa says, let the inspired Scripture then be our umpire, and the vote of truth will surely be given to those whose dogmas are found to agree with the divine words. And Irenaeus says, they, meaning the heretics, gather their views from other sources than the Scriptures. We have learned from none others the plan of our salvation than from those through whom the gospel has come down to us, which they did at one time proclaim in public, and at a later period by the will of God, handed down to us in the Scriptures to be the ground and pillar of our faith. Now, amongst these competing doctrines, what do? It seems as though there are passages which say actually tradition is very important, and other passages like with Irenaeus and Gregory and Hippolytus where it's almost clear that Scripture is our ultimate source and norm. And we seem to find these contradictory statements in the church, in the early church. And at this point, I think Roman Catholics pick the quotes they like and Protestants pick the quotes they like, and often it becomes quote mining, unfortunately. But I think what we need to do is work harder. And I think we can synthesize, we can reconcile some of these statements. And we can do that by looking at the tension in Scripture itself. For example, in Mark chapter 7, verse 8, Jesus says, disregard the commandment of God and cling to the traditions of men. So Jesus is very clear that what he cares about is Scripture, and we cannot compromise that by introducing the commandments of men. Whereas in 2 Thessalonians 2:15, Paul says, therefore, brothers and sisters, stand firm and hold fast to the teachings we passed on to you, whether by word of mouth or by letter. Now here, it seems as though Paul does care about tradition. I think when we synthesize these verses together, what we find is that traditions aren't bad, but we need to see where they come from. Do we have any proof that the Assumption of Mary came from the apostles? We don't. So it cannot be mandatory to our faith. For me, if the Assumption of Mary was an optional doctrine, I'd be comfortable with that. But it has been made mandatory for our faith, and that's where the problem lies. And the other point is that even ecclesiastical traditions are very good. We should listen to authorities in our church. We should listen to our pastor, our priest, or whoever kind of has written influential stuff over the past. But at the end of the day, if that undercuts the authority of the Bible, that's when it should be rejected. I think it all comes back to, do we hold Scripture as our highest authority? Do we hold Scripture as our only source of that final authority? Do we see Scripture as the only infallible source of everything that we need to live a life of godliness and goodness, knowing that it is by Scripture alone that we come to the knowledge of saving faith? Thanks so much for listening. Thank you for watching. If you liked it, please hit like and subscribe to this channel. That'll help this channel and this video reach more people. Thank you again, and God bless.